Hello and welcome to the Karate Priest Podcast. I'm your host, Father Daniel Duplantis. I'm a martial artist, musician, airman, and a priest of the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux. One of my other passions in life is teaching, especially teaching about the Catholic faith. Catholicism is a very deep faith. Jesus himself told Peter to put out into the deep for a catch. The most significant answers to life's most important questions often lie deep beneath the surface. Many people have questions about their faith. Through this podcast, my aim is to explore these questions and encounter incredible people along the way. Their stories show that God is constantly at work in our lives every single day, sometimes in the ordinary and sometimes in the extraordinary. Some of the topics treated in this podcast may be sensitive or controversial, but their discussion holds the key to truly living as God created us to live, which is to say that He created us to live in authentic freedom, loving Him above all else. Thank you for joining me on this journey of faith, and I hope you enjoy this podcast. Hey guys, and welcome back to the Karate Priest Podcast. I know it's been a little bit since I've done any content and some new episodes, and there's a really important reason for that. As some of you guys might know, I am from South Louisiana, and back at the end of August, we got hit by Hurricane Ida. And Hurricane Ida, in our minds, is probably the worst hurricane to hit South Louisiana really in anyone's lifetime. And so today what I'd like to really do is just to share with you guys what happened leading up, what happened with the hurricane itself, where we are right now, and just to kind of give you guys some insight what things look like on this end. Y'all, this was catastrophic. This is something that you really just can't put a lot of words to without actually seeing things. And so while what I do today in this episode might not really give any justice to what happened down here, my hope is to at least kind of share with you guys what happens with hurricanes in South Louisiana. And at the end of this podcast, I'll plug in some information for you guys if you want to check out more about where we are with this hurricane relief and what has happened and to hear people's stories. I'll do that at the end of this episode. So basically what happened was, so Hurricane Ida hit on a Sunday. And so the week before was when we got the information that a tropical depression had formed in the Gulf of Mexico, actually kind of a little bit south of the Gulf of Mexico, really off the northeast corner of South America. And so when these depressions form, we tend to start looking at the radar, at where these things are going, satellite radar. And it never ceases to amaze me just how fast these hurricanes and these storms can form and can get so big and so catastrophic so quickly. And so Ida was no different. I remember I was teaching at a friend's classroom on the Thursday of that week. And that's when I saw that tropical storm Ida had formed. And we looked at the trajectory and it was coming straight for us. That's what I think was really just remarkable about this hurricane too, was just how accurate the track was. It's amazing sometimes with the spaghetti models that you see on the Weather Channel or anything that shows these spaghetti models in the cone of uncertainty. It never ceases that sometimes that the initial zone of impact or the initial plotting of the course of the hurricane usually ends up not being the case. There's usually some kind of shift. We've seen that a lot in the last couple of years where we've been right in the direct path of a lot of these predictions, but they never ended up giving us direct hits. This time we were not so fortunate. And so they said just because of the conditions in the Gulf and the conditions around Louisiana at that time, they said there was really no doubt about it. This thing was coming straight for my diocese, straight for the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux. And we are right on the Gulf of Mexico, y'all. We're about 60 miles southwest of New Orleans. And a lot of my diocese is coastal waters. If you look at a map of Louisiana, especially our area, it can be a bit deceiving because you can see Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes, or that's what we call counties in Louisiana. We call them parishes. If you look at Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes, which comprise the majority of my diocese, the lower parts are actually mostly marshland. It's a lot of water. It's not until you get about halfway up the diocese that you actually start seeing more solid land and not so much marsh. Even in and around the area, there's still swamps, but to say that these coastal marshlands comprise a lot of the southern part of the diocese, um, that's what we're dealing with here. So flooding is always a major concern for us. And so this thing was coming right towards us. And so I remember, people starting on that Thursday making plans. We always want to have plans. In the beginning of every hurricane season, typically people get things ready before hurricanes even start coming. Getting non-perishable foods together, stockpiling batteries, gallons of water, things like that, getting a generator and gasoline for the generators. We simply sometimes just don't know in advance like how bad a hurricane is going to be. And I don't think anyone ever really imagined we would get a hurricane this bad, something as bad as Ida. We've had a lot of people live through a lot of bad storms. I know a lot of people, a lot of the older generation in Louisiana talked about Hurricane Betsy back in the 1960s. And as catastrophic as that one was, people said that was the worst one in their lifetime before Ida. Ida hits, and my grandparents I stayed with for the hurricane said Ida was the worst one they have ever seen. And most people are saying the same thing. It's not uncommon to see people staying in place and not evacuating for major hurricanes in Louisiana. There are a lot of people who will tend to stay even with mandatory evacuation orders, but a lot of people did not leave. As a priest, I myself decided to stay. As an associate pastor, I really didn't have the responsibility of having to keep all of our documents and records safe. That's usually left to our pastors in our diocese. And so I was able to stay here in Louisiana. And so my family evacuated on Friday before the hurricane. My family told me they were getting out. And so my grandparents decided to stay. And so I told my mom and dad, since I was staying, I would stay with my grandparents and ride it out with them. And so got to tell my family bye before they left for Galveston, Houston. And that was it. The day before was really just kind of eerie in a way. It was beautiful, but we all knew what impending doom, I guess you could say, was coming. That Saturday, I just remember waking up. It was a beautiful day outside, gorgeous. And it was almost strange to think that, there's a massive hurricane coming in the Gulf. It passed over Cuba, I believe, as a Category 1 hurricane, but it really, really quickly strengthened over the Gulf. And by the time it hit South Louisiana, it became a very top end Category 4 hurricane, and that's what it was recorded as, was a very top end Category 4. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with hurricanes, anything considered 3 or above is a major hurricane. And so in Louisiana, in my lifetime, I've been through several hurricanes, but none of them have ever been this big. Last year, Southwest Louisiana, the heel of the boot of Louisiana, got hit by 2 back-to-back major hurricanes. One of them was Hurricane Laura, which they're still recovering from. And then a month later, they got hit by Hurricane Delta. And so we have seen evidence of what happens with these major hurricanes. And I think maybe there's just this kind of sense of, if it doesn't happen to you, you don't exactly know what to expect. You could see videos, but unless you actually experience these things, sometimes it's hard to really imagine, oh, this just might not happen to us. It won't be this bad. But y'all, it was. This hurricane was absolutely monstrous. And so that Saturday, the day before, I celebrated a vigil mass in my grandparents' dining room. So we had mass together for the evening. And then after that, we really just kind of hunkered down. And so we knew it was going to hit probably right around noon, or at least we'll start to see the effects about noon on Sunday. And so I remember waking up in my mom and dad's house, which is right across from my grandparents' house, just kind of locking everything up, getting everything ready, moving things, unplugging things, because there's always going to be a power outage with hurricanes. That's basically a non-negotiable about hurricanes, is that the power will go off. And so just making sure that things were taken care of before I left the house. And then walked across the street to my grandparents, and that was it. At that point, it was hunker down time. It was too late to get out for the hurricane. And people always calling their relatives back home who stay and say, look, is it too late? By that time, it is too late. When you get to the day of a hurricane, the road conditions will be too bad to get out. The contraflow traffic is going to be awful. So we were there. We had no other choice but to stay at this point. And so and basically just to kind of backtrack a little bit of what's the actual preparation process when something like this happens. How do you prepare for the point where you are now hunkering down for a hurricane? Most people will board up their windows. And so that's something that's kind of standard with most Louisiana houses, is to either have shutters that you can use to cover the windows, or in the case of my family's house, we don't have shutters. We just use plywood boards. And so there's usually people have a way of boarding up their windows, because with high force winds, they're going to be throwing debris everywhere, and you never know what's going to end up flying through the air that could break a window. And so houses are boarded up. Again, people go and get their emergency supplies. And so that's really kind of where we're at. And so we get to the day of the hurricane, and all the windows are boarded up. And my grandparents have a storm door that we were basically able to watch everything unfold throughout the day. And it was terrifying. We're watching the news that morning, the local news channel, just to get some last minute updates, just to see what's going on. And as this hurricane started to move on shore, we saw video footage from the lower parts of the diocese. One of those areas being Grand Isle. And Grand Isle is an island right off the coast of Lafourche Parish. That's basically an island in the Gulf of Mexico. And to get there, you take a bridge. And so it's just right there off the bottom of Lafourche Parish. And so they had video footage of just the water, the flooding already happening, the winds just pelting houses. And then the camera footage goes out. And when the camera footage goes out, that's when we're like, oh boy, this is going to be a bad one. And so we're sitting there, we're watching the news, and then eventually about 11 o'clock in the morning at my grandparents' house, the power goes out. And at that point, we knew we would probably not have power again for at least a couple of days. We weren't sure how long exactly, but at least a couple of days. And so here we are, hunkering down in the house. There's really nothing else to do now but to sit, to watch, and to pray. And so, we start seeing the wind pick up a little bit. Some small branches off the trees were now coming off and into the yard. And then as we get into the early afternoon, we start getting to 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. We knew we were right there in the eye wall. And so we were getting some small updates that we still had some cell phone usage during the hurricane itself. And so my parents were watching the news for us in Texas, and giving us updates as they would come, telling us about where the eye was, just to get an idea of how long we have to ride this out. And so, and then when the power goes out as well, one of the first things you need to do is, if you have a generator, you want to have the generator kind of, powering essential things. And so one of those things usually is your freezer and refrigerator, because if you have food in there, you don't want it to go bad. You don't want it to spoil. So most people will prioritize freezers and refrigerators for their generators. If you have a big enough generator that could power the whole house, great. Some people have what's called a Generac, which is a natural gas generator that can, some of them, power the entire house. My grandparents had a rather small generator. So for us, the priority was the freezer and refrigerator. And thank God for that, because it really gave us enough food for the next couple of days, before we could really go get other supplies. And so we just sat and wrote it out that day, and we're watching everything unfold. The wind started blowing from the back of the street towards the front of the street. And it got to a point, it was so powerful, the wind, that these larger branches started coming down. And after the larger branches start coming down, we start seeing trees being uprooted. And that was terrifying. We have several trees in my mom and dad's front yard. And so we're watching my mom and dad's house from my grandparents' house, because they're right across the street from each other, watching just these large branches come off of our cedar tree, off of our maple tree, thankfully not falling on any of my mom and dad's vehicles. They had taken my sister's car to Texas, so both of their vehicles were still there. And then the crepe myrtle trees we had in our yard, the crepe myrtle trees, one got completely blown down. The other one got blown down. Then when the wind changed directions, got picked back up again, and then leaned against the house. And these are some solid trees, y'all. Like the fact that this wind was able to knock it down, pick it back up, and then throw it a different direction. Um, Gosh, guys, you can't really imagine this unless you see it in person. Wind's so powerful that it can do this. We were looking down the street out the storm door, and we saw one of our close neighbors. They had an oak tree, a large oak tree in their front yard that was completely uprooted and basically fallen against the bedroom of their house. That's what we could see, at least, in our immediate block of the street. And then one of the heartbreaking things too was to look across the street and to watch shingle after shingle get torn off of my mom and dad's house. And just watching it. And by the time the hurricane was over, there were hardly any shingles left on the front side of my mom and dad's roof. And we could see the plywood being exposed on the roof. And I'm like, oh, this isn't good. So now the paper underneath is gone. And so I'm just sitting there wondering, and this is right over my bedroom. I'm seeing the quadrant of the roof that this is happening to. It's right over my bedroom. And so I'm sitting there thinking, what on earth does the inside of the house look like? Is there water everywhere? And you just sit wondering, and you feel helpless. You don't know what to do. You can't go across the street until the next day when the hurricane passes. And so here we are sitting there, and then at the same time we're wondering too, because we can't see out, we can't see what's happening to the house that we're staying in. We don't know if my grandparents' house is losing shingles or not either. So the house that you're inside of, you don't know what's going on outside, what damages are being done. And so there's this great feeling of just helplessness, of just having to sit through this. And so it's very powerless as well. You just feel like you can't do anything except sit and wait for hours. And one of the bad things about Hurricane Ida was that it traveled so slow over land. So the wind speeds were over 150 miles an hour, but the ground speed was very slow. It was maybe about 10 miles an hour. And that's why this was so devastating, was because it traveled so slowly that we had to endure these very fast sustained winds for a very long period of time. And so as it got dark and there was nothing else to do, there's no power, so we can't see anything. We can't turn on any lights. About 8 o'clock at night, I went to bed and just wondering what I would see in the morning when we woke up. And it was probably, it was probably the last, more or less peaceful sleep I knew I would have for the next couple of days. Just to go to bed. The temperature was not that warm in the house with the AC being out. The house was still, for the most part, a comfortable temperature. So I went to bed. The next morning when I woke up, my gosh, it's hard to put into words exactly what I saw the next morning. I got up and it was daylight outside, and I was almost afraid to face what was out there. I go outside. My grandmother's already working in the yard, picking up branches and whatever she could by herself. And then I go outside and I see my mom and dad's house. Most of the shingles are gone on the roof. I go walk around the house. Our air conditioner unit was flipped over on its side. So many down branches. Again, those crepe myrtles leaning against the house. These massive branches from the other trees just down, shingles all over the place. And so what I did was even my dad's boat. My dad has about a 14-foot aluminum hull boat that we used to go fishing, a small little boat. But the boat on the trailer was flipped on its side. In fact, not only was it probably flipped on its side, it looked like it had rolled a few times by the way that it was so far away from where it was parked. That's how strong this hurricane was, guys. It was able to flip my dad's boat on the trailer. It was insane. It was insane to see all this. So I'm taking pictures because we know that we're going to have to file insurance claims for all this. Down power lines everywhere around the house. I go in through the garage door because I couldn't even unlock the front door. And so I go in through the back door of the house, and thankfully the site was a little more a little better than I was expecting, because like I said, with all the shingles being blown off, I had no idea what to expect walking into the house. And so I walk in, the kitchen looks fine. The living room looks fine. And then I go into my bedroom, and already I can see the water on the drywall, on the sheetrock in the ceiling. And I was like, okay, this is not good. You could see the drywall. I could see the roofs or the ceiling starting to separate. over my bed. And I was like, okay, this isn't good. This is probably going to collapse at some point. So I went in and moved out as much as I could. That was really a value. And that's the thing too, at the same time, I'm thinking insurance can replace pretty much all of this. And I know my mom and dad have insurance, they have content insurance, homeowners insurance. This can all be replaced. But the reality is, guys, there's some things in the house that, yeah, they can be replaced, but there are some things that just have so much sentimental value and personal value that you really don't want to replace some things. So, for example, one of the things that I got out of my closet before the ceiling collapsed was my belt rack, my Taekwondo belt rack. Again, these are all, cheap belts. I mean, these belts are maybe about, $10 a piece. But this belt rack has my original white belt that I started out with and wore 20 years ago. And so for me to just go buy a $10 white belt nowadays, that white belt means absolutely nothing. But the one that I wore 20 years ago when I started my martial arts journey, that means a lot. And to have my original belts that I wore to train with, like that's something I wanted to save. So thankfully I got most of the valuable things in there. And then sure enough, the next day the ceiling collapsed in my bedroom. And so the insulation had fallen on the bed, which thank God the bed was just a recent hand-me-down bed, nothing of importance, nothing brand new. So that's going to be replaced with the insurance. But thankfully was able to get everything else when the ceiling had indeed collapsed. But you could already smell like the water, like the mildew and stuff. And so one of the first concerns when that happens in anyone's house is, is there going to be mold? And I'll get into the mold in a few minutes as well. And so that was honestly the worst room of the house was my bedroom. And so, and really, I'm fortunate because my mom and dad, at least their bedroom was not affected. In fact, what they did was they were able to gut my room out rather quickly when they got back home. And they were able to really kind of, dry things out. We don't have any mold building in the house, so we won't need mold remediation with that. Everything's going to be replaced. And so the rest of the house is livable. Mom and dad are living in the house as normal right now. It's just we have tarps on the roof. But I'll get to the tarping in a second too, because that's a whole nother story. So anyway, after I go into mom and dad's house that morning, I go back to my grandparents and tell them, look, I'm going to go back downtown to see if I can get to my church, to get to the cathedral. Because I'm still the associate pastor. I still, I want to make sure that I can see exactly how the church came out, how the church fared. That was my next big priority, was to see how did my church come out. And so thankfully, my mom and dad only live about 15 minutes away from the cathedral, but getting there was absolutely horrific. And so I put on my clerical, my clerical attire and my collar, and I get in my car and just driving up my mom and dad's street, trees everywhere, having to dodge some trees in the road, down power lines. You're seeing exactly, you're starting to see the damage, widespread for the very first time, seeing just so many people who have lost shingles off their roofs, people already in their yards picking things up, things flipped. It was just incredible to see the damage, especially things like down trees. For these massive trees to just be uprooted like they were and snap like toothpicks just says a lot about how powerful these storms can be. And so that's what we were dealing with. And so I'm driving up the street. I turn onto the main highway in my little town, and it was almost like playing Mario Kart, guys. I mean, having to drive on the highway. There's trees in the road. There's down power lines in the road. There's the power poles themselves were snapped like toothpicks. Having to drive around these things, I wasn't even sure if I would get out of Bayou Blue to get to downtown Homa, to actually get to the cathedral downtown. But I made it. It was kind of difficult to do, but I was able to get to downtown. Had to really snake my way through the back streets of Homa to get to the back parking lot of the cathedral. But that's the thing, is as soon as I got downtown, and one of the first things you can see is the steeple of the cathedral. It's one of the tallest buildings in the city. I could see that there was already copper missing off the bell tower of the cathedral. But it was standing. At least it was still standing. And so I was very glad to see the cathedral was standing. It just had some copper missing on the bell tower. So I pull into the cathedral. I park in the back parking lot. And I get out my car, and there's all kind of little branches on the sidewalk. I can't really see anything noticeable from the back of it. I'm just walking around, but then I get to the front, and that's where I see the major damage to the cathedral. The sign, the big stone sign in front of the cathedral, was blown over. The front fence was just bent out of shape. And then I look at the front doors, and my heart just sinks. The front sets of doors, we have 3 front sets of doors on the cathedral. The middle set was intact, but the sides on the left and the right, those front doors were blown in completely. And these are heavy oak doors, and they were just absolutely blown in. And I walk inside, and the vestibule of the cathedral is just trashed. The wind and the water that got in there just made a mess of the vestibule. Picture frames that were lying on the ground, shattered. It was just wet everywhere in there. Walk inside the church, and there's water in the aisles, water on the pews because it got blown in from outside. But other than that, the inside of the cathedral itself remained intact. So this was all just going to be water remediation for us, and just replacing the doors. Which this is today's date is actually October 30th as we're recording this podcast. It's now 2 months after the hurricane has hit. And we still have not gotten the front doors replaced. So here we are 2 months later, and that has not happened. Just to show you how slow this is. But those doorways were covered within that week, just to make sure that the contents inside the cathedral remained there, and the remediation started. The cathedral school suffered several busted windows on the front, but the structure remained intact. The roof was intact. And so for the most part, my cathedral parish fared extremely well. In fact, we were probably one of the first parishes to get back up and running in the diocese. And so, it was amazing that not long after I got there too, Father Jay pulls up, Deacon Lee, he gets there. And so we're all 3 surveying the damage ourselves. One of the frightening things at this point was that there was no cell phone service for many people the day after the hurricane and for several days after, or it was at least extremely spotty most of the time. And so that morning, after the hurricane had hit, that one of the first things you want to do is tell your family who's evacuated that you're okay, that you made it out. And that morning, I remember looking at my phone, I had no service. I couldn't even call my mom and dad to let them know we were okay, that we had survived. And so, I thought maybe going downtown where, in the city, we'd have some reception. And I didn't have any on my phone. Thankfully, the husband of our assistant principal for the school was there as well, surveying the damage for his wife. And he actually had some kind of cell phone service. And so I asked, if, as a big favor, if I could just call my mom and just let them know we were okay. I got to talk to mom for about a minute before the service cut out again, but at least to let her know we were okay. We were all okay. We had survived. And we were just at this point, trying to clean up a bit, but we'd be in touch as soon as we can. So that was checking out the cathedral. The rectory actually fared extremely well. My room here at the rectory was untouched. We had a couple of small little holes in some of the windows, but nothing bad. My room, again, completely fine. The biggest problem for my room, though, was that with the heat, it was rather unlivable. That it was just absolutely unbearable to live in the heat of this rectory in late August. And so what I did was, in the immediate wake of the hurricane, was I stayed at our diocesan retreat center, which was running on generator power at that point, to have at least a comfortable place to stay. But I'll get to that in a second later. So after I go to the cathedral, I go back home to my grandparents to let them know how the cathedral fared, start taking pictures of things at mom and dad's. And then a lot of it was just sitting and waiting. I remember, I got back to my grandparents' house, changed back into some comfortable clothes, a t-shirt and some shorts, and just took a nap. I remember taking that nap was such an escape from the horror that was around us. Just this awful sight of the aftermath of this hurricane. And I remember waking up from that nap and just thinking, I wish I could have stayed asleep. It was absolutely horrific waking up to that again and just like, this is our reality. This is what we're going to have to deal with for the next several weeks. It was survival mode. It was absolutely survival mode. You're eating what you have. You're kind of just sitting and waiting for things to happen, for the power to come back on, for people to come back home. My mom and dad didn't get to come back home until 3 days after the hurricane had hit. And so here we are the day after, on that Monday, um, finding spotty cell phone service. Every now and then, I would be able to get something where I could call mom and let them know what had happened. Um, and then, so a lot of it was sitting and waiting. So that Tuesday, 2 days after the hurricane, one of my big priorities for mom and dad's house was to try to get tarps on the roof, because we still had some days of weather, some showers that were coming, and with the way the roof was, my ceiling had already collapsed in my bedroom. I didn't want anything else to happen to the house. So thankfully, my sister's fiance, he had driven all the way to Delcom, which is about a 2-hour drive from where we live in Homa, to get massive tarps just to put on the roof. And this is the thing, y'all. I had never been on anyone's roof before, let alone my own parents. And so I thought maybe going to seminary for 7 years would get me out of doing roofing work. But that's the thing. Mom and dad couldn't come home until Wednesday. And so Simon comes over, and he's a police officer. And so he was in between shifts. He was working 18-hour shifts with the hurricane relief. Comes in between shifts with whatever time he had and said, Dan, I need you to get on the roof with me. And there was no questions to be said. There was no complaints, because I was like, I know I'm gonna have to do this anyway. To help protect the house, to help keep whatever's left intact. I knew I was gonna have to face my fears and get up on the roof. And it was terrifying, y'all. I remember getting up on the roof thinking, oh my gosh, this is steep. And really just like it was really engaging every single muscle in my legs, just to stay on there and to not fall off. And so here we are climbing around the roof, putting on this massive tarp with the wind still blowing a little bit. And so we're trying to get this thing on before, and we see another rainstorm coming in the distance. And so we're trying to get this thing on, nailing this tarp down. Oh gosh, it was terrifying getting up on the roof, but we got it on. Thank God we got the big tarp on the main part of the roof. So at least we could say we did that. So then the next day, Wednesday, mom and dad were driving back from Texas. And at the same time, my uncle, who had also evacuated with my mom and dad, my uncle got a phone call that he had been given the job by Catholic Charities for our diocese, a job he had applied for before the hurricane hit. And so it's amazing he applied for this before Ida was ever a thing. And they called him while he was evacuating to say, you got the job. So when you get back, you can start immediately. He was supposed to be overseeing the food banks for Catholic Charities in our diocese. So my family drives back on Wednesday. Mom and dad didn't get back to the house until Thursday morning because of the curfew that was in place. But I knew that as soon as mom and dad got back, I'd have been sitting around for a couple of days just taking care of my grandparents. But I was ready as soon as mom and dad got back to see how I could be of use as a priest, to start being there for people, because I knew people could use a priest at this time. And so mom and dad got back Thursday morning, got to see them, give them a hug for the first time again. And it was very difficult for mom and dad to walk around the house and see the damages that were done. And I know it was a lot of emotions that day. But once we kind of visited with them for a little bit, I said, well, y'all can take care of the grandparents now. I said, I'm going to go to see where I can help out. And so I knew my uncle was starting his first day on the job at the retreat center, where they were organizing the hurricane relief from there. And so I met him there and started talking to all the representatives from Catholic Charities just to see how can I help out. They were very glad to have me there because there really wasn't anything else to be done. Our churches were damaged. There was no power. We couldn't even celebrate mass in our churches for the first couple of days, because we had to get people to come look at what repairs needed to be done. We didn't want to have mass in unsafe conditions. And so I figured the best way for me to do something and be useful was to help with Catholic Charities. And so thankfully we had help. We had Catholic Charities from Acadiana, so that's from the Lafayette Diocese, and Catholic Charities of Lake Charles coming in to help us with immediate aftermath as well. And so I'm working with my uncle to help get things going, start, helping to prepare hot meals. We had food from Second Harvest Food Bank. They were bringing pre-plated meals that we just had to heat up. We're trying to give hot meals wherever we could bring them to. and just trying to come up with a game plan of what do we need to do in the immediate aftermath of this hurricane, who needed immediate help, what shelters were there that we could go and bring things to, supplies, whatever we could find. And so that was what we did the first couple of weeks, was a lot of just, getting immediate needs met, trying to get supplies, people bringing in supplies from out of town. And so that's what we were doing. And so since I was going to be working there for the next, probably about a week or two, they invited me to move into the retreat center, just to kind of be around, to be a priestly presence with the teams to help coordinate efforts, because there really wasn't anything else to do. And so I was able to move in there. The day that I moved in there, though, we got an email from our program manager for the Air Force for the chaplain candidate program. And so this is kind of bringing, the military thing into it now as well. And so we just got a brand new program manager. And that's he just got there like the month before in this new job. I'd never talked to the man in person before. We just corresponded in emails just to kind of keep up with things that we have to do in the program. And so he sends an email to all the candidates asking what our status was in regards to Ida. Were we affected, and what do we need? And so I emailed him. I said, sir, my diocese was in the direct line. We took a direct hit. I said, it looks like a war zone here. I said, we need anything and everything, canned goods, gasoline for generators, and anything, literally anything. And a few minutes later, he called me and he said, Lieutenant, he said, I was shaken by your email. I'm from Idaho, so I don't know what hurricanes really look like. What is going on down there? And so I explained exactly what was going on. I said, sir, it looked like a bomb went off in this area. There are buildings that are literally destroyed. Downtown, there was a brick building that the building was just shattered, and there was bricks in the streets. Roofs were ripped off of houses and buildings by this hurricane. So people literally lost everything. Some of their houses were completely demolished. It was like a bomb went off. Or I should say, it looked like we were bombed. And so that's what we were dealing with here. And so he said, you just do what you got to do to be safe. He said, if you need anything, let me know. I'll try to talk to other chaplains and see if we can get some resources down there. And so that was just incredible, to tell him, like, he had no idea what was going on. He said, Lieutenant, we're not seeing anything about this on the news. Like, we're seeing some things, but unfortunately for us, because Houma Thibodaux is such a smaller area, we don't get the attention that New Orleans or Baton Rouge does. So New Orleans was getting attention. And yes, they were affected by the hurricane, but not to the extent that we were in Houma Thibodaux. Houma Thibodaux was absolutely destroyed by this hurricane, but we weren't getting the same attention as New Orleans. And so he said, you really don't see a lot of things about this hurricane on the news. And so it's been great for at least for me as a priest, to be able to tell the story, to tell people exactly what happened with Hurricane Ida and what is still happening, because there's still a lot that's happening. And so that was a very interesting phone call to happen. And so again, I moved into the retreat center. I started living there, working with Catholic Charities. And as soon as things got running again at the cathedral, we got our power back downtown in Houma. We were having masses again in the cathedral. We did our water remediation already very quickly. So we were going to be back to a full schedule of masses. We're going to be opening up the cathedral as normal. The school was going to be coming back in session again after, the window repairs. And so from there, I was going to move back to my room at St. Francis. And here's the funny part, is the day I was going to move back into St. Francis to the cathedral, I got a phone call. I just finished eating lunch. I was about to go pack up my room, pack up the few things I brought with me to the retreat center. And I get a call from the Vicar General. And the Vicar General says, and he's from Uganda. I'll see if I can get his accent right. Father Daniel, the diocese has need of your services. We are appointing you as the point of distribution liaison. We have talked to Father J, your pastor, and he has no objections. Do you have any objections? I said, no, sir, I'll do whatever the diocese needs me to do. And so he said, all right, good, we'll see you tomorrow. And so I didn't know what to expect at first with this job. They told me to get in touch with one of the liaisons who worked in our Office of Parish Support and to ask him exactly what, to brief me on this job, because I didn't exactly understand what point of distribution liaison meant. It just, all I could tell is they had a job for me. And so I meet with Joe, who works in our office of power support, and he says basically my job is going to be overseeing all of the church parishes in our diocese that were distributing supplies to make sure they had the supplies that they needed, to visit them, to assess their needs, and to make sure those needs were being met, and then to coordinate all the supplies that we were getting from other places, from the warehouse, things like that, and make sure that they were getting to the places that needed them. And so I was working uh, that particular job for probably about a month. So what that job entailed was to visit places, to call. I had several points of contact from all of these church parishes distributing supplies, to call them every day and to ask them, what distributions are you doing today? Are you distributing hot meals? If so, how many and when? So we could put that on social media. So if people are looking for their next hot meal, they could find it. To ask them, what supply needs do you like? What do you want? We have stuff in the warehouse. We're getting shipments, pallets, and trucks of things coming into the warehouse. Just asking them, what do you need? Here's the supply list that we have. What do you want? And then basically what I would do is take all of those details, all of that data, put it in a daily spreadsheet report, and that would go off to all the directors of Catholic Charities, to the bishop, to the vicars general, anyone who had a hand in the hurricane relief got these reports. And that was super important, just to make sure that everyone who needed that information, that it was coming through me. And so there's a lot of pressure on me to make sure that I was getting accurate information, making sure that, people are actually having their needs met by getting the information they needed and getting the resources where they had to go. And so it was basically, as my uncle had put it, because I was essentially working for him, because he was appointed to direct the hurricane relief with this new job that he was given. And so basically he said I was his field intelligence officer. So my uncle was retired from the Army. He's the guy that commissioned me into the Air Force. And so he uses military terms with me a lot. He said I was his field intelligence officer. Which they said was one of the reasons they brought me on board to do this job, was because of my military background. We had a lot of former military who were helping us with this job. And so that's what we were dealing with. It was just absolutely incredible to see just how bad this hurricane was, to see the affected areas, to hear people's needs, to hear their stories of the things that they needed at this point to rebuild. And so I did that job for about a month. And then after that, and that's the thing too, I'm also still the associate pastor at the cathedral, but for the most part, my day-to-day things have been limited at St. Francis. I still celebrate weekend masses. I'll celebrate daily masses in the evenings. But for the most part, my 9 to 5 job has been working at the pastoral center with hurricane relief. So I'm not doing school masses. I'm not doing nursing home masses. I'm not doing really a lot of the things that I was doing before with this hurricane. One of the reasons why also, I haven't been able to record new content for this podcast is we've been without internet for weeks. We just got our Wi-Fi at the rectory working again. It took about 2 months after the hurricane hit. And so the situation down here is still very dire. And so phase 1 of our recovery process has been meeting immediate needs. My job with supplies has now been repurposed. Now I'm working more with case management. So I'm still working at the pastoral center, but I've been doing a lot of data entry and helping with taking the information that we're getting from what do people need now to rebuild, and working with the vicar general to figure out a game plan for how are we going to help get these people's needs met. And so now we're working on case management. Now we're working on long-term recovery goals with this hurricane. And so that's basically where we're at with this now. And so the reality is, this is something that we're not out of the water with, guys. I mean, this is going to take a long time to recover. There are people who are still living as if Hurricane Ida hit yesterday. There are people who are living in tents in their front yards. And part of this case management, one of the sad things is I get to read their stories. I get to read stories of commercial fishermen, which is a huge industry in this area. People who have lost their boats, lost all of their fishing equipment, and lost their houses. They have literally nothing left, and they're living in tents on their property. Some are displaced. Some are fortunate to have friends or relatives they can live with right now. Some are not. Some are putting that they are living in a tent on their property until FEMA can provide temporary housing, which is taken forever to get down here, but there's still not enough. The situation is still extremely dire down here. And so there's still a lot of needs. This is going to be a very long recovery process. This is going to take probably more than a year, because we're seeing with Lake Charles that got hit by Hurricane Laura last year, they're still recovering. They're still waiting for federal money. They're still waiting for aid money to help with what they need to rebuild. And so for us, we're going to be in that same boat for a long time. And so that's the story of Hurricane Ida for us. That's what happened here. It was a disaster. It was absolutely catastrophic. And so for us, this is our reality. This is what we're living with for the foreseeable future. And so with that, if any of you would like more information, to hear other people's stories, to hear personal stories about how they've been affected by Hurricane Ida, to help us out, if there's any ways you want to help, we do have a website for our diocese, and that website is catholiccharities.ht.org/Ida. Again, catholiccharities.ht.org/Ida. And that website has all the information, all the stories of people, in any ways that you can provide help. They will give you resources on ways you can help, whether it be money, supplies, things like that. Any help would be appreciated. And so at this point, one of the biggest help that we need is prayers. Prayers for our people, prayers as we help people recover from this. This was the worst disaster any of us down here have seen in our lifetimes. And so with that, it's going to be a lot of healing. There's going to be a lot of frustration, a lot of anger. But I think with this is an opportunity, and this is what I've been telling people in my homilies. This is where the church can thrive. This is where for us as Catholics, for us as Christians, the church can really thrive. This is where we're called to challenge ourselves to be the hands and feet of Jesus Christ, to bring his love, to bring his help to the people next to us, to show that he is there and that he is suffering here with us in this process. But to realize also that there's hope. There is a hope that we can rebuild with. There is a hope for people that if God has blessed us in the past, he will continue to bless us into the future. And so with that, that's one thing that we're holding on to most in this area is hope. Hope that South Louisiana will rebuild from this, that we will continue to have a diocese here. But most importantly, that our faith is what gets us through all this and will continue to get us through this for the foreseeable future. So with that, thank you for joining me on this episode. Again, it's been great to actually tell our story, to be back on this podcast and to come back with this episode, to share with you guys what has happened here, what has been our story. But it is great being back with you guys through the podcast. We will have new episodes coming out soon in the future as well. And so with that, thank you and God bless. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of The Karate Priest. If you enjoyed this podcast, go ahead and like The Karate Priest on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're ever in South Louisiana, come visit me at the Cathedral of St. Francis de Sales in Houma. If you have any questions or comments about the show, you can also email me at thekaratepriest@gmail.com. Your questions are welcomed and may be used in future episodes. May the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit come down on you and remain with you forever. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fisher and distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure to visit the official website for the International Association of Metatomics at metatomics.org or find us on social media for other unique content.